All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I'd like to welcome you all to the first webinar in our winter speaker series. Um, I'll mention it again at the end, but we have a couple more coming up. Our next one is scheduled for January 14th. So keep an eye out on the CaDC mailing list or on our website for more information. I'm hoping many of you are familiar with the CaDC and who we are, but just for a quick update for those who are new, the California Data Collaborative is a nonprofit membership-driven organization where water agencies collaborate to create tools and applied research supporting planning and analysis within water districts. And ultimately, our goal is a water sector that's inspired and empowered to make informed and data-driven decisions. So as part of that, we collaboratively develop software tools. We try and connect folks inside of water agencies with folks like Jose, who are doing really cutting edge research. And we host events to sort of build community around water and data. So without too much further ado, I'd like to introduce Jose Bolorinos, who is our speaker today and is a PhD candidate in civil and environmental engineering with a focus on atmosphere and energy, and an MS student in statistics. Jose's research focuses on data-driven, systems-level strategies for coordinating urban water and energy supply infrastructure. As part of this work, he has investigated policy approaches that better understand and manage the life cycle impacts of the energy sector on watersheds, air quality, and carbon emissions. Jose has also developed closed-loop customer monitoring and segmentation tools that allow water and electricity utilities to quickly track the responses of their customers to demand shocks inside and outside of their service areas. Currently, he is developing data-driven methods for optimal design and operation of energy storage in the wastewater treatment sector. But before I hand it over to Jose, I just want to say really quickly that the first time that I heard about this this work that Jose has been working on, that he'll be discussing today, I was just super excited and blown away, because it's exactly the sorts of questions that I think many he's working on really many of the exciting questions that I think folks today in the water industry are interested in, looking at things like how do customers rebound from drought? How does that rebound differ across different sorts of water customers? How do customers respond when a drought first starts? Some folks dive right in early on, other folks take their time, or maybe don't respond at all. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Jose.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks everyone for being here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present my research to everyone, to water utilities, to industry, to other academics. It's really a privilege. So I'll share my screen. Make sure here that you can see my slides. Presentation mode. Okay, so everything's good. You can see my slides.
Looking great.
Okay. So yeah, I am going to talk about some research that I've been doing with Nusha, who is my dissertation co-advisor, and I'm also co-advised by Ram Rajagopal in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And this research really focuses on understanding. It asks the question: how long does a water saving, if a customer starts saving water, how long does that conservation survive for? As a way of trying to parameterize rebound using survival models. And so the motivation for this is really the common problems that most urban water utilities face in the 21st century. One, population growth and urbanization, which is putting more demand pressure on already pretty scarce water resources. And then climate change is increasing in many semi-arid and arid regions of the world, the likelihood of droughts and the severity of droughts, which means that those stretched water supplies have an uncertain future. But the opportunity really that motivates this work is that more data streams and more computational tools and computing power allow us to better understand customers, and demand management can become more effective for planning. And it really is a very useful tool for reasons that I'll go into, being able to understand and to some extent influence customer behavior in your service area if you're a water utility. And one of the main ways in which it's really useful is in the drought setting. So understanding how droughts and the policies and the context of a drought and the public awareness affects customer demand. And the reason why that's so useful is because user behavior during a drought can be a really valuable resource. It's like an insurance policy that you could call on. So, you know, in California, in the most recent severe drought, 2015, there was a statewide average urban water use reduction of 25%. So it's like saying, well, I'm going to call on an extra 25% of my supplies because I have a shortage. So it's very, very useful. And there's evidence that a lot of this is externally determined. The work that Nusha has done with one of my colleagues, Kim, and some of the prior research we've done, which shows that customer conservation was really linked to spikes in media coverage and awareness, Google searches of drought-related search terms in California. But the major question that motivates this research is, well, what happens when the drought is over? We observe all this conservation. Some of it seemed to be independent of utility, active utility demand management policies. It was just because people were worried about the drought and conserved on their own. But how long does this behavior last for? And this really gets to, answering this question really gets to the different value streams that demand management can provide for a water utility. In the short term, as I said, conservation or behavior change can buffer against supply shortfalls and is really useful. But in the long term, another kind of service is provided, which is more water use efficiency, and decisions by customers to either install efficient appliances or make changes to their landscaping effectively provides a long-term source of free water. And that's another value. And understanding the short versus the long-term impacts of something like a drought is really useful for that reason. So the motivating question really for what I'm going to present is, as I said, what's the lifetime of water savings? And really that gets to, for demand management as a service, what type of service are customers supplying during drought episodes? And our objective is to use the recent California drought as a case study, asking, well, okay, what was typical conservation survival in terms of, you know, how much rebound was there? So how many customers rebounded, and in general, how long did it take for them to rebound? And how did the extent and timing of rebound vary by socioeconomic groups and by customer groups? And then the second question, which is we thought was really important to ask as well, is whether extreme droughts produce more persistent savings. So, you know, is this public awareness of an extreme drought and media coverage likely to make very lasting changes relative to a drought that's not so severe? And to do that, we compare California's most recent 2012 to 2016 drought to the prior 2007 to 2009 drought, which was in itself was severe, but wasn't quite as severe as a 5-year drought. The method that we use to identify conservation and rebound is based off of some previous research that we published in Nusha's group, which is consumption change detection. And that process uses 2 steps to identify what we'll call conservation and rebound events. The first step is training a machine learning model on each customer's consumption using local weather and local economy, so mostly local area unemployment, to try and predict what water consumption is under normal conditions. And then taking that model and applying it during a test period on which it hasn't been trained, so say during a drought, and then see what the deviations are in consumption behavior from what was observed previously, and then applying a change detection procedure which fits a step function to those deviations. And that step function gives us the magnitude and location of a conservation event, which would be a decrease in the step function, and then a rebound event, which would be an increase in the step function. To measure conservation survival, we use the step function for each customer. So what we do is in a follow-up period, which in our case is January 2014 to December 2018, we observe conservation events that are detected in 2014 or 2015. And so at the point at which a reduction in consumption occurs, then we start to follow a customer up, or to follow them in time. And the time it takes for them to increase their consumption to a point that reverses 75% or more of the savings from the conservation event, then that triggers a rebound event. And the time that we estimate from that is our time to rebound. And we model this time to rebound as a survival process, which is just a model that looks at what affects the probability of having a survival time greater than a certain amount of time, and looks at how that varies for different covariates. And in this case, it's customer and demographic characteristics. So the study setting here that we're using for this analysis is the Mesa Water District, who just acknowledge the Justin Finch at Mesa Water, who's been so helpful with us and helping us to answer questions that we had about the customer data, sharing all the customer data, sharing additional information with us, like data on water use efficiency rebates. It's been really, really valuable for us to be able to do this analysis and have Justin there helping us at every step of the way. Mesa Water is a really good case study for this because, well, it has a service population of about 110,000, but it has a lot of multifamily residential customers as well as single family residential. So it gives us the ability to look at how conservation survival varies by customer type. And it also has a lot of socioeconomic diversity. So median incomes at the block group level range from about 25,000 to 125,000, which is really, really broad variation that can help us to understand how conservation survival may be different for different demographic groups. So the study timeline really is looking at, so our data run from 2002 to the end of 2019. The initial period through the end of 2013 is we use to train our data, to train the machine learning models and the first step of the consumption change detection procedure. And then in the second phase is the phase where we obtain those deviations in consumption from what we would expect, and then run the change detection procedure to obtain detected conservation and rebound events and run the survival analysis. And this period has a lot of important events from the 2012-2016 drought. So we've got Governor Brown's state of emergency in January 2014. We've got the first statewide mandatory urban watering restriction in May of 2015. which ends in April of 2016. And we have a good 3 years after that point to observe how consumption evolved once that restriction ended. So just jumping right into results, for looking at conservation events in 2014 through the end of 2015, so January 2014 to December 2015, we detected conservation among about 55 to 60% of customers. Slightly more single-family residential customers had a detected conservation event. If we look at the median size by customer group as a percentage of their baseline consumption, which baseline consumption was estimated from 2002 to 2013 data, pretty substantial. So we're looking at 30 to 35% reductions that were detected as a percentage of baseline consumption. For rebound, as a percentage of conserving residences, so residences for which there was a detected conservation event in 2014 and 2015, through the end of 2019, we detected some extent of rebound. Like this figure is the share of residences that had at least any increase in consumption at all, not necessarily an increase that reversed prior savings. So 40 to 50% of them had at least some increase. And we'll get into like how many of them had an increase that reversed prior savings. The average size of those increases was a little bit less, so 25 to 35%. You see a little bit more rebound among multifamily customers than single family customers. If we look at customers that did rebound, for whom there was some detected rebound, and we look at how the rebound extent as a share of baseline consumption, which is on the x-axis, compares, or sorry, on the y-axis, compares to the savings percent as also as a share of baseline consumption, which is on the x-axis. The dotted line is showing unity. So the dotted line is if a customer saves 50% of their baseline consumption, and then they rebound by 50%, then they basically reverse the same amount, like they reverse their savings, right? And note here that savings as a share of baseline consumption can approach 100% for residences that had a lot of consumption growth in the baseline period. And then, that means that they're gonna have a lower mean. And if you have a really large reduction from a high point as a result of that consumption growth, you can have relative savings that are close to 100%. It doesn't happen in very many cases, but it definitely is an eyebrow raiser, and that's why that can happen. But what you see from this relationship is that the line of best fit is this blue line, fit by a low S smoother, and what that tells us is that generally the larger a conservation event is a share of baseline consumption, the less likely that it would be completely reversed. So the smaller the relative rebound is going to be. It sort of flat lines after about 50%. So in this region, we're seeing conservation events that are very drastic, customers that are really reducing their consumption by a lot. And if they do increase their consumption, it's unlikely to be increase. If they do rebound, it's unlikely to be so big that it reverses all of the savings that we observe for them. But what about timing? So the previous plot is showing, okay, well, what's the extent of rebound and how does it compare for people that have different conservation event sizes? But what about like how long it takes to rebound? This plot is showing, this is a Kaplan-Meier plot. The x-axis is just time after you observe a conservation event. So it's not a calendar time. It's just I start to observe a customer. When they start to conserve, then I start the clock. And it's up to 5 years that I can observe them for. And the y-axis is showing the likelihood that they will, after X amount of time, have not rebounded, so that they will have survived, the survival probability of their conservation. and it's showing it for single family and multifamily customers. That's in the top panel. The bottom panel is just showing a slightly different result. The time axis is different, so I'm just showing them together because they show something very similar. The bottom panel is showing error bars, so 95% confidence intervals and point estimates for what the average conservation survival time was for each customer type. So what the top plot shows us is that after 5 years, if somebody started to conserve after 5 years, the probability that a single family residential customer would have rebounded to an extent that reversed most of their savings was about 25%. So 75% of customers had not rebounded. Maybe they'd rebounded a little bit, but not to an extent that reversed most of their prior savings. The probability of survival is a little bit lower with multifamily residential customers, but it's still pretty high. So we're looking at about 72%. This implies a mean conservation survival time of almost 8.5 years for single family residential customers. That's just the average. Whereas for multifamily customers, a little bit less, about 7 years. So how does this conservation survival time vary according to customer characteristics? What this is showing is the results of the survival model or the accelerated failure time model. So what's plotted on the x-axis is how each characteristic is associated with conservation survival time. So positive values mean longer survival time, more conservation survival, and negative values mean less. And each panel is showing the influence of a certain customer characteristic and is showing the point estimate and 95% confidence interval for each customer type, because we estimated the effect of each customer characteristic separately for each customer type. So starting from the top, what you see is that relative savings, so this is the same variable that was plotted in the previous plot, density plot, which is savings that were detected for the conservation event in question as a share of baseline consumption. And so what you see here is that's positively associated with conservation survival time. So just like if you were to observe very, very large customer savings relative to their baseline consumption, that made their rebound, if they were to rebound, likely to be a lot smaller. It also means that it's going to take them longer to rebound. So this really suggests that for utilities observing very large reductions in customers' water use, it's likely that they're going to be more permanent than if they're smaller, which it makes sense. The second panel is showing the logarithm of a customer's baseline consumption, which for single-family residential customers is a good proxy of well, a rough proxy of their wealth, because more water use implies larger gardens, maybe a swimming pool. And so that shows roughly the wealth of the customer. For multifamily residential customers, it doesn't. It's something else. It's more units. So that's another reason for modeling them separately. So what we see here is that there is a slight positive relationship. Larger, more average water use is associated with more conservation survival. So probably wealthier customers are a little bit more committed. The third panel is showing the effect of a change in occupancy during follow-up. So if I observe that a customer conserves and I start to follow them up to see how long that conservation event survives for, and then there's a change in occupancy, a change in water accounts during the follow-up period, then that variable would be 1 and 0 otherwise. So what we see is that for multifamily residential customers, there's not really any effect. But for single family residential customers, a change in occupancy is associated with less conservation survival, which may have to do with changes to landscaping or other residential infrastructure that make the previous customer savings less likely to persist. And then the last panel is showing the effect of efficiency rebates. We don't show this effect for multifamily residential customers because there were not enough efficiency rebates observed for that customer class that we could estimate its effect on conservation survival. And we're truncating the 95% confidence interval for single family residential customers because there were so few rebates observed with rebound outcomes that the confidence interval was very wide. In general, they're only about something like 0.3% of the customers for whom there was a conservation event had some sort of rebate. So it's hard to observe all efficiency rebates that may be happening because not all of them or will be administered by a utility rebate scheme. Or sorry, it's hard to observe all upgrades in residential infrastructure because not all of those will be tracked by a utility administered rebate scheme. But as a result of that, there's a lot of uncertainty about what an efficiency rebate is doing. We would need to observe more of them to be able to say anything about their effect on conservation survival. For now, it's inconclusive. This plot is showing similar effects on conservation survival, but for demographic characteristics, and these are measured at the block group level. And for all customers together, we don't separate by customer type. So what this is showing is that in general, younger neighborhoods, again, this is the block group level, and more politically progressive neighborhoods have more conservation survival. The effect isn't huge, but it is significant. And also neighborhoods that have more owner-occupied homes, which makes sense as the people are going to be more likely to invest in improving their water use efficiency. Okay, so that's the severe drought, and that answers the first set of questions about conservation survival and how it's different for different groups and what its extent and timing was in the more severe recent drought. The next question that we wanted to look at was, well, okay, how does conservation survival in the more recent severe drought, 2012-2016, compare to conservation survival for the 2007 and 2009 drought, which was less severe? So to answer this question, we ran the same analysis, but we did a different 5-year follow-up period. So the 2012-2016 analysis looks at conservation events that were detected in 2014 and 2015 and follows those customers up until the end of 2018. For the previous drought, we look at conservation events detected in 2008 or 2009 and then follows them up through the end of 2012. So this is a similar Kaplan-Meier plot showing conservation survival for the 2 drought periods for all customers together. What you see here is that from the legend, you can see that there were many more conservation events detected in the more recent drought, so about 8,000. The previous drought, in 2008 and 2009, only about 4,700 or 4,800 conservation events were detected, so there were fewer. But this clearly shows that their survival probability was higher, especially as time went on. So they tended to be a lot more persistent, and rebound was a lot less likely. This is somewhat counterintuitive, as you would expect that a severe drought would maybe lead to more drastic changes in water use behavior and that might be more permanent. So to investigate why this would be the case, we looked into this a little bit further. This plot, to break it down, so essentially what the x-axis is plotting time elapsed since the beginning of each follow-up period. So the dotted line is showing the January 2008 to December 2012 follow-up period. The solid line is plotting January 2014 through December 2018. And so, you know, t equals 1.5 for the more recent drought would be May to June 2015, which is when the mandatory restriction was imposed. And you can see that that's when you see this bottoming out of consumption, which is shown on the y-axis. So the y-axis is showing residual water consumption for each customer group, averaged over all customers. And it's showing the average of all conservation and rebound events detected at each point in time. So it's essentially showing the average of the step function that's fit by the consumption change detection procedure during each follow-up period. And it's showing how it evolves. So, it's set to 0 for January of, or for, t equals 0 for each follow-up period. And so this really gives us some clues as to why we would observe less conservation survival in the more recent, more severe drought than in the previous, less severe drought, which is the dotted line. So what you see is that there's this really, really steep decline and a bottoming out of consumption to about t equals 1.5 after the beginning of the follow-up period. But for the next 2 years or so, you see a lot of rebound. It doesn't reverse all of prior savings, but it does increase to a level where about 5 years after starting to follow up that customer group, you see that long-term savings, long-term declines in water consumption as measured by the average of all conservation and rebound events detected is pretty similar for the two droughts. You have a similar picture for multifamily residential customers, except that it seems like their savings ended up being a little bit greater at the end of 5 years. So what this really suggests is that there was a lot of the public awareness and the media coverage of the severe drought led to a big boost in short-term savings and a lot of behavior change. But that extra conservation was more likely to be temporary behavior change instead of more permanent behavior change or changes in residential infrastructure. That's what that suggests to us. So takeaways from this analysis, regardless of whether or not one drought had more or less persistent savings, drought conservation was quite persistent. That was our main conclusion from this. So only about 25% of residences rebounded after 3 to 5 years, which is not many, a lot less than we would have assumed coming into this analysis. It implies a water savings lifetime of 8 years, and that's on average. So for some customers, it can be a lot longer. And if we look at, from the previous plot, of the 2014 and 2015 savings that were achieved, about 2/3 of them remained after 3 years, which is pretty good. It means that really, in terms of like absolute amount of water saved, the persistence implies that 2/3 of savings are still there 3 years later. And if we look at both drought periods, the permanent reductions in water use equate to about 10% of water use, residential water use, for each customer type. So that is a pretty substantial long-term decline in water use if we were thinking long-term is 3 to 5 years. This persistence, as we show, really depends on the magnitude of savings is a really important predictor. If you're observing really, really steep reductions in water use, they're more likely to be persistent. They're less likely to be completely reversed even when a customer does start to increase consumption. Changes in occupancy are likely to make conservation less persistent. And then cultural, political factors seem to be important. They're not hugely important, but they are a factor that's significantly associated with conservation survival. And then lastly, there's no evidence that an extreme drought produces more persistent savings than a less extreme drought. In general, it seems like utility conservation campaigns and water use efficiency rebate schemes and encouraging people to do turf replacement is always going to be pretty effective. So yeah, that's essentially that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. We hope that this can be a useful top-down customer analytics tool that can help us to better understand how persistent savings are because as we saw with rebate schemes, they are not widespread enough to be able to track all changes in, say, like, water efficient washers and dryers, or changes in landscaping and irrigation, smart irrigation and such. Talking to Justin at Mesa Water, he said that in one analysis they ran, only about so they had a rebate scheme for smart irrigation systems, and they had rebates that they had tracked, and when they got in touch with the manufacturer who registers all systems that are purchased and then tracks where they're purchased, the amount of the number of smart irrigation systems that were registered in Mesa's service area was 3 times the number of rebates that they had awarded. So this gives us a way to also track customers that maybe we can't observe certain things through rebate schemes with those customers. So yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It's been really great to be able to give this presentation to you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. Just logistics wise, feel free to ask your questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself for a moment, that's also welcome. So open the floor to questions. It looks like we have a question coming in from Anna Garcia. Do you know if the conservation messaging and state actions were more urgent or prevalent in the 2012 through 2016 than in 2007 through 2009 drought?
Yeah, that Nusha would be able to would know more about that. There seemed to be more public awareness and more media coverage, at least outside of utility campaigns in the more recent drought. So in 2014 through 2016, I assume that Mesa Water had, and there was the Mesa Water Saver campaign in 2014 through 2016. So they had a local conservation campaign. I'm not aware of the conservation campaigns that they may have organized in 2008 through 2010. But I think in general, there was more public awareness in the more recent drought. At least that's what our data, that's what our general conclusion has been.
Chris, I'll add something here. First of all, thank you for inviting Pepe, and Pepe, great job presenting your work. Obviously, there's nothing more to be proud of when your student can do such a great job. So I'm proud of you. I think with the drought, what we have seen as the recent drought, because of its severity and the extensive media attention that it received, it just showed a lot more impact in behavioral change that we were, and many of it actually happened before the mandatory restrictions went into place. And we have done some research on that. I'm happy to send it to you. You can email Pepe or email me directly. It's nusha@stanford.edu. Basically, those savings were mostly people responding to the public awareness because of the extensive media coverage.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's in the change detection work.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Do you mind just clarifying real quick the difference? Because I think when you've spoken at prior CaDC events, you've talked about the change detection work. Could you just quickly touch on I guess how that that work relates to this work?
Yeah, so this work builds on that work because that work was just a method for detecting unexpected changes in consumption behavior. And so if you do that, you can see when there are lots of conservation events and lots of rebound events, and then track those in time, so pinpoint when they happened. And so the analysis looked at also the most recent drought and found that there were spikes in detected conservation events that coincided with spikes in media coverage, and that a lot of them occurred before the mandatory restriction, when there was no coercive policy or fine or anything telling people to conserve. So that's the research we're talking about. And then this research takes the ability to detect conservation and rebound event and then adds the survival time on that as a way of looking at conservation survival.
And one thing, again, I add there is the innovative part of the survival analysis piece is that it has been used before for especially medical research to understand different biological survivals and how different microbes and viruses survive over time. So it is, or actually vaccination, there are a lot of different application outside of the water sector, but this is the first time it's being used to understand rebound in the water sector.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. I'm going to go to the next question we have in the chat from Michael Hollis, and that's: are there any plans to look more closely at the behavioral component? For example, looking at beliefs and attitudes.
Oh, not necessarily, or I don't know, Nusha, if you have plans to look into that. This is a analytics tool that's a top-down. We just look at the data and what's the end result in terms of water use. You could link this to surveys though, and use this method to validate survey-based results of conservation attitudes, definitely. But this is supposed to be just a plug and play for a utility that can just look at its billing data and figure out how conservation differs for different types of customers.
And I guess one thing I'll add there is that in some of the work we have done with my now graduated PhD student, Kim Quasnell, we did try to use alternative data sources to better understand how you can come about understanding different attitudes and decisions. And I think that media study we did, in a way, sort of does that, because the coverage and the Google searches, in an alternative way, shows you how people care or want to pay attention to what's going on around them. And in one of the follow-on to that study, we also showed that regardless of what water source people had, if it was a recycled water or actually potable water, people still saved, because there was so much media awareness around them that, and even if they were not required to save, for example, recycled water users were not asked to save, they still saved, not maybe as much as the people who were using potable water, but actually almost quite significantly. So just, that is, and I think the closest we get to the belief part is what Pepe did with the sort of a political affiliation, which in a way sort of shows that there might be some sort of a little bit of a bias towards people who are, more Democrat, probably more environmentally savvy. But again, it's just very hard to kind of zero down on those.
Yeah. We have another question here from Mike T. Did you account for reduction in use from legislation? For example, SBX 77, 20 by 2020.
Well, it's hard to do that because the legislation affects all customers. What we can do is observe whether legislation was associated with an increase in or like a spike or more conservation events. But in this analysis, we did not. I mean, where all customers face the same legislation and the same sort of statewide policy environment. And so the differences between customers are controlling for those. So no, we didn't. But it's definitely an important question whether it's led to a sort of long-term creep or a temporary surge in conservation behavior.
I mean, I think in your change point detection study, you did incorporate that as a policy sort of stressor that came in some of the analysis you did. You should definitely share that link with the audience. They can take a look at it. I don't think we called it SB7, X77, but it was actually a point of policy intervention that we included in that study.
Yeah, we did include, we did really explicitly look at the association between state level policy actions and the likelihood of a conservation event. So yeah, maybe that was in there. I'll definitely send that along.
Yeah, we have two questions here. One from Anatole Falagan and one from Henley Gromlich, related to demand hardening and efficiency hardening over time. And how do you think that will affect future droughts going forward? Do you think it's a big deal? How does it play into this work?
Yeah, we worried about that because long term, if you observe a really persistent conservation event in a residence and the customer is still there, then maybe they're less likely to be able to conserve, in a future drought. And so we did run that analysis comparing customers that had a previous large conservation event in the previous drought to customers who hadn't and that were in the same residence. And we didn't see a significant difference. So it doesn't seem that we've yet reached that point, but who knows, maybe in the next drought, there would be a difference. Maybe there had been bigger changes.
Maybe I interject a little bit here as well. Look, I think demand hardening is a thing, but we are so far off from hitting the bottom in any city or community in California that it's going to take a long time before we hit that bottom. And I just give you as an example, as a resident of San Francisco, and I know we don't have a lot of outdoor spaces in the city, but right now per capita water use per day is 35 gallons per person per day. So that's a very, very low. And maybe you want to put a buffer on top of that a little bit, but still when you're looking at 100 to 120 gallons per person per day, that there's still like at least 70 to 80 more gallons to be saved before we really hit that bottom. And I honestly don't even think San Francisco has hit the bottom. So we'll see.
Let's see, from David Sumi, we have, when measuring household water use, was it raw water use or were you able to stratify by end uses like toilets and irrigation?
No, this is raw water use. This is bi-monthly billing data, which I neglected to mention. This is the customer's meter, what we observe. It's not disaggregated.
But we did have, I think Pepe can expand on this. We did have users that had outdoor water use, and not in this study, we did not zoom into them, but in the change point detection, we did zoom into the people who had only domestic meters or domestic and irrigation coupled. But for this study, we didn't use that. And then also on the, we have done some study with smart meters in Redwood City, California, which for those, it's much, for some of those cases, we do actually have specific outdoor meters that we have been using for our study. So the more detailed metering one has, the better you can do with this kind of study.
Yeah, I think the question, the point about looking at AMI data going forward is potentially a very interesting one. A lot of possibilities as folks roll that out.
Absolutely.
Maybe for the next drought, right?
I mean, we have written a number of research articles on using smart meters and what you can do with smart meters, and we are happy to send them around if anybody is interested. The possibilities are definitely endless, but I would say one challenge is how do you sort of use those smart meter data and sort of what's the IT behind them and how much, how the information is sort of can be used in different ways. There's so much complexity there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. So we have a question here from AR El Katabi, asking if you know how much MESA changed their policies such as prices after the drought?
We don't, I don't think there were any price increases after the drought. We have pricing data for the first 15 years, and there were increases before. But in terms of policies, there was no big change. So Mesa had, it had its mandatory restriction, which it lifted in April 2016, and then there was a change in wasteful water use. There was an ordinance passed in October 2009 that was permanent. So really, there's nothing else that changed between that point and now.
Maybe I also add something there, maybe highlighting the importance of our partnership with Mesa. We work with Mesa and Justin specifically in very direct, very closely. They were involved in a lot of, not in our analysis, but we definitely ran a lot of our assumptions by them to make sure we are not exaggerating or underrepresenting anything that they have done. And that has been actually a motto for our team. We always work very, very closely with the utilities we do research on, just because we feel they can bring a wealth of knowledge and information that we would like to take advantage of.
Yeah, they basically read every manuscript and make comments on every point, or Justin does.
Yeah.
So
but the same with other ones too. And again, that has never happened to us, that they would make a specific comment about the results or outcome of our analysis, since we really hold those closely, because we want to make sure the integrity of our research is intact. But they are definitely part of the process of us setting up the modeling and study that we do.
Yeah, so this question about prices got me thinking. So obviously the behavior in rebound sort of behavior, rebound response from both these two droughts was not identical, but it gets me thinking, are they similar enough that you could start to estimate for planning purposes, as an agency? Like, if you're in the middle of a drought, you're going to have to update your rates. How much rebound should you plan for when you're setting your rates? Do you think there's enough sort of certainty or enough there to really look at how much can we expect in the future?
I want to make a quick comment here. Actually, there was some study during the same time we did the media study for the Bay Area. Another group did a study on a group at University of North Carolina were approached by a few water agencies in California to kind of evaluate if their price change is impacting water use. And what they found actually was the price change has not really impacted as much the way people use water. And that was their finding. We have sort of incorporated price in different ways as a factor in different studies we have done, but we hadn't done a direct study on pricing. And basically our observation is the same. It's just it doesn't come out as a significant variable. There's so many other external factors that impacts people's behavior.
Yeah, to add to that, prices are, I didn't mention it, but prices are one of the variables that are used to train the consumption change detection procedure. So it builds in responses to prices. But just to respond to your comment about comparing the two droughts, it's really hard to, because they were of different durations. One lasted a lot longer than the other. There were other things that were happening, like the Great Recession towards the end of 2008, that really would confound any way of like saying, well, what's the impact of X amount of drought severity? It's a useful comparison to make, just to look at how they differ, but it's really hard to infer the impact of a severe drought. I suppose if you were a utility and you had a record of the last like 10 droughts for which you have data, and you just looked at each one and ran some sort of analysis that looked at like a 5-year period and tried to estimate the effects, then you could come up with roughly, you could gauge what the effect is. I mean, we observed it's similar for the two. So like a 10% permanent reduction 5 years later. That's what we see for the 2 droughts. And on average, you know, conservation surviving 8 to 10 years, 10 years for the previous less severe drought, 8 years for this one.
Great. Yeah, thank you. We have just about 4 more minutes, maybe 3 minutes here. So I suspect we won't be able to get to everyone's questions, unfortunately, but thank you for the active participation.
Yeah, and also feel free to email us. We will answer your questions if you email us.
Yeah, maybe we could get like 1 or 2 more if we have time. So let's see, there's one from Sonali Abraham, which is, were you able to see any seasonal changes in persistent savings?
Seasonality is incorporated into also into the training of the models and the consumption change detection procedure. We did not consider that for that reason. Although I imagine there might be more spikes in rebound during warmer seasons when there's more of a reason to start using water. So if you install a new irrigation system, you're going to observe an increase in the warm season. But no, that wasn't something we explicitly considered. We controlled for it, but didn't consider it.
We controlled. I mean, you have to explain. So we did control for it. So it's not like we ignored it, which means that we took out seasonality. So what you see here is the trend, which actually incorporates changes up and down for whatever reason it is. So seasonality is out though.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess there were no like additional changes in seasonality above and beyond what was visible in the baseline, I guess. Because I guess you could imagine, you know, if folks save more in the winter or save less in the summer, like maybe that you would have seen a wiggle in that trend line you were showing, potentially, but maybe there's a saving sort of equally, you know, well, how do I say this? Proportionally through seasons? I don't know.
There's no seasonality in the results that so if, you know, this previous plot here, you know, you don't see a seasonal fluctuation. You would if there were. So yeah, not really. But I mean, I think that it is still a question that could be considered whether maybe the probability is slightly higher in a warm season, a cold season. We're already controlling for it, so we wouldn't expect it, but it's possible.
Okay. Well, I think that's about all we have time for. So I want to, you know, thank Jose and Nusha. Really appreciate you folks taking the time to, you know, come on here and discuss your work. As I said at the beginning, I really think you are sort of pushing the frontiers of how we understand water demand and asking a lot of the right questions. So I guess keep up the good work.
Thank you.
And to everyone else, like as I mentioned, we have more webinars coming up. Keep an eye out on our mailing list. If you somehow registered and you're not for this webinar and you're not on our mailing list, please sign up at californiadatacollaborative.org, and we'll see you in the future.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.